All right, hello everyone. I think it's time to get started. Welcome to the Defence Tech briefing from Dealroom. My name is Orla Browne. I'm Head of Insights at Dealroom, and I'm going to be your host. So Dealroom is a global startup, venture capital and innovation database. This is the first online briefing of this kind that we've done before, and clearly it's a topic that is resonating with a lot of people. So we've got a lot of interesting organizations here today. So we've got a mix of early stage investors, late stage investors, corporates, primes, government departments, agencies, which is actually a fair reflection of the type of organizations we typically work with, actually. So we tried to help bring transparency to startup ecosystems through data and by connecting a lot of these key players in different startup ecosystems. So today we're going to be starting with some exclusive data and insights from my colleague Lorenzo, and then we're going to have a really interesting chat with Kelly Chen, part of the founding team at NATO Innovation Fund, and Leslie Hitchcock, who's one of the co-founders at Resilience Media as well. So we'll get their reflections on some of the data and also some of the latest developments that they're seeing in the market as well. So yeah, without further ado, Lorenzo, I'll hand over to you to share some of the findings.
Yeah, thanks, Orla, and nice to have you all, and thanks for joining. Yeah, I'm the research lead at Dealroom, and today we will present a few insights, also updated from a report that we presented at the Resilience Conference in London in September, and about the state of the market in defense tech. I lead all our research and insight around defense, deep tech, space tech, and related topics. And then we will have a deep dive, like Orla was saying, with Kelly and Leslie that can tell a bit more about the qualitative side. So to start with, there's a lot of discussion about what is defense or not. In all the slides that will follow, I will focus mostly on what we call as defense and defense application. So these are really companies that either are fully focused or primarily focused on the defense and military market, or that they work on different segments, and one is defense, but this is like clearly stated, disclosed, and proved. While broader dual use can be longer term technology that might have an impact, later on in defense, or are adjacent topics that are relevant for defense, like sometimes space access, like ISAR, or dual use drones, like Swiss drones that are mostly civilian, while something like quantum system is already deployed in Ukraine. So we take this approach to really focus on what is the defense market, because there's been this broadening of the dual use concept, and we think it's still good to keep some distinction between the two, especially because it's so blurred sometimes. So what we did is to go and classify hundreds of companies in Europe and globally around C4 ISR, weapons and defense system, UAVs, UGVs, maritime tech, hyper defense, supersonic, quantum, and so on. And then we use these insights, of course, to pull what we show today. Overall, of course, as we are all feeling in the market, the defense tech space has been booming. In Europe, VC funding is close to hitting 1 billion this year, which is 5 times more than a few years back in 2020. By comparison, instead, the overall VC market, so the tech investments startups, is down 50% since 2021. So it's completely different. And of course, this is due to mega rounds like Helsing, but also in general, early stage, breakthrough stage, all stages are showing strong activity. So this year, defense tech made up 1.7% of VC funding in Europe, up from just 0.5% 2 years ago. And similarly, across all NATO allies, it's 2% of the overall investments, which is actually the same kind of 2% that was the target spending for the NATO alliance in terms of GDP. There's no like direct correlation, but it's interesting that they're pretty much aligned. When we look beyond Europe to all NATO countries and allies, the picture is similar. Investment is up 4 times since 2019, almost 5 billion this year, and definitely the number of rounds that is not shown here is the similar picture both for Europe and all of NATO. Strong activity at all stages. A lot of funding going into, in general, autonomy and AI, from really hyper defense, but also drones, UGVs, and all these kind of things. The US makes up the vast majority of funding that has gone into defense and defense application in recent years, 82% since 2018. The EU 27 follows with 11%, and UK with nearly 5%. The rest has seen still very limited activity. When we look at spending, so we are now abstracting away from just the startup and VC market, looking at the general picture to then go back in. US is, of course, the world's largest spender in military technology. In 2023, this was amounting to over $900 billion, and more than 10 times any single European countries. But taken together, the European Union was around 300 billion, similar to China. One topic is that, however, EU spending is very fragmented, like was spotlighted by the Draghi report, with over 80% happening at national level. And then, of course, the UK is the largest spender in Europe, but it's not in the European Union. When we look at the share of GDP, of course, Ukraine has been the largest spender, and that's become an accelerator of defense innovation. So a lot of the startup in Ukraine, but even in the rest of Europe and the rest of NATO, have been deploying technology rapidly in Ukraine, and this has really accelerated the market in innovation. Overall, most countries in Europe are still below the 2, now up to 3% target, especially the big ones, UK, France, and Germany, were in 2023 at 2.3 to 1.5%. And now the new NATO boss, Mark Rutte, is pushing the ambition to raise the spending from 2 to 3%. So Europe is still catching up to this level of spending, but it's going in the right direction. Especially at the time of the Ukraine invasion, most of Europe was still underspending in rate of commitment and also lagging a bit behind in capabilities. But this has been rapidly changing with all nations in Europe and areas like the Nordic Baltics taking really strong action. And we are seeing this reflecting in the startup ecosystem. When we look at VC funding in Europe, the top 3 markets, Germany, United Kingdom, and France, have attracted over 80% of the total investment in the last year, since 2018. And this is quite some concentration, because for the rest of tech, this is just 63%. So it's really mostly being concentrated in these 3 markets so far, but this is also spreading out. Especially Germany has been really the hub for Europe, and especially EU27. When we look at the single hubs and cities, definitely Munich has been the most prominent, not just because of Helsing, which made a big jump, but also quantum system, ARX, robotics, and many others. And it's also been like the city where many of tech events now around defense, Munich Security Conference coming up. So it's definitely posing itself as an hub for defense. And then we see seats of the top 12 European cities being in the UK, a very widespread ecosystem, not just London like it's in other tech areas, but in defense we see many other industrial hubs spread across the country. And then we see Paris, Berlin, but also Lisbon and Madrid coming up from Southern Europe. When we look at who's funding these companies across NATO allies countries, mostly top investors are from the US, of course, historically. We see names like A16Z, HBC Founders Fund, General Catalyst, US Innovation Technology Fund, Shield Capital. but also some European investors have been ramping up, of course, like Project A Venture and the NATO Innovation Fund that we will have in the discussion later on. Still, when we look at Europe, a large share of the funding has been coming from the US, with up to 55% this year due to some very large rounds. There's almost no investment, whether coming from Asia or like regions that are not aligned. So there's not like a strong maybe geopolitical risk behind the funding that the startups are taking, but it's still a lot of reliance, of course, on the US for funding in the defense tech ecosystem. As a comparison, the US was 94% domestic in defense tech, so pretty much no money from Europe or anywhere else in the world. The defense tech, the defense investor scene has been changing a lot in the latest months and 2 years, especially. Now there's a really strong cohort of emerging defense-focused VCs in Europe, mainly covering from pre-seed to Series A. Some of them are also attending this webinar. Names like 201 Venture, D3, Offset Venture, Allied, Expedition, Scalewolf, and many others. And then there's a strong scene of deep tech investors, which are active in defense and also security and resilience, like NATO Innovation Fund, Project A, 7PC, Crew Capital, and also some generalists have been doing a few deals like Venture Capital, Mosaic, 30, 360 Cap. Space, it's its own space usually, in the sense that it has its own dedicated scene of investors, which has been already established in the market. And then there's a lot of course, of international US investors like General Catalyst, very active in Europe, but also InQtel, LATS, names that have been active in this market for over a decade, while mostly this has been coming up recently in Europe. One topic that is always discussed and worrying a bit founders and investors around defense tech is the challenge in exiting these companies. Of course, it's not super easy to have large exit in the defense sector. However, if we look at what's been happening recently, we can see that there are multiple exit pathways for large exits in defense tech. M&A is, of course, an option. In the US, there's been this year a really big acquisition of Spirit Ecosystem by Boeing. This Spirit Ecosystem is not a VC-backed company, but it could have been, and is still a notable case. While in Europe, we have seen Preligence being acquired by Safran recently, and this shows that there can be notable exits, under million or billion exits in this way, but also some dual-use companies can be acquired by corporates outside of defense. This is the case, for instance, of Recorded Future, which is a cybersecurity company, which, among other things, like fraud detection, is helping protect Ukraine critical infrastructure from cyber threats. And this was acquired by MasterCard for 2.7 billion. When we look at the public market, of course, the last few years have seen, in general, less listing activity from tech, not just defense tech. But if we look back at what Palantir did, going public in the rush of the bull market of 2020, it's then showing really impressive performances, growing from 22 billion to now over 170 billion of market capitalization, and now definitely established as a defense prime in the US. So definitely the public market is also opening up for these companies and can be an attractive way to exit. Beyond defense, key dual-use sectors like space, quantum, and semiconductor have all seen investment ramp up strongly recently in Europe and globally. So definitely there's momentum across the whole stage, like really military tech applied, but also all the rest of security and critical technologies. One segment that follows a bit different logics is the cybersecurity one, because even if it's a segment that is very relevant for national security, most of the market is still commercial, and most startups are SaaS-oriented models with different investor and logics. So this space follows mostly the overall tech market, and we can see a trend which is very different from what we've seen before for defense-related topics. In Europe, this year has shown quite some pickup in activity, but still less than the 2021-2022 years. Overall, in the NATO countries, there's activities down almost 70%. Even if we see some activities picking up again. And in general, most of the market is still US-based. When also we look at the top investor, is different names that we were seeing into defense. So Insight Partner is the most active globally. Also other US investors like Accel, Evolution, Lightspeed, we see more generalist name that also back enterprise software, SaaS in general, than just deep tech and defense oriented. When we talked before about dual use and defense, but there is another framework to look at this market, which is in the lens of defense, security, and resilience. And this is what we are doing with the NATO Innovation Fund. So here is an example of 6 challenge areas identified by the NATO Innovation Fund, with some example of startup that we selected. So this view doesn't really, it's not exactly the same as dual use. So something like nuclear fission or energy storage is not dual use per se, but it's definitely very relevant for security. So the spotlight that we are working on is around deep tech startup that are important for the long-term independent success and strategic positioning of Europe across these topics. And we are working on a full report that is coming out in February 2025, and we'll also be presenting and be present on the Munich Security Conference in February 16-18, together with NIF. And now I leave the space to Orla to moderate the discussion with Leslie Hitchcock from Resilience Media and Kelly Chen from NIF. I'll be sticking around for questions or if there's anything needed, but I'll leave mostly the floor to them that are much more knowledgeable than me on the qualitative and discussion side of defense tech.
Yes, amazing. Thanks so much, Lorenzo. So I think super interesting that like defense tech is a segment where VC is at all-time high, and it's really bucking the trend of the overall venture capital. So really cool. So we want to have a bit of a chat with Kelly and Leslie on some of the findings now as well. If people do have questions for either of them or for Lorenzo, please do put it into the chat. And we'll try and get some of them to them as well. But yeah, first of all, welcome Leslie and Kelly. Thanks for joining us. I want to maybe start with the fact that both of your organizations are fairly new, and maybe that's kind of a reflection of this area as well. Maybe you can explain a little bit about your organizations and where you saw the gap that you're aiming to fill in the market with your organizations. Leslie, maybe we can start with you.
Sure, happy to. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here alongside Dealroom and NIF. So I'm Leslie Hitchcock. I'm from Resilience Media, which is, like Orla said, a new company. We are a media company, and we founded Resilience Media off the back of Resilience Conference, which is also brand new. It was founded in February of 2024. My background is I was in the business side of TechCrunch. I ran the global events business for quite some time and worked on their international expansion on behalf of TechCrunch. And when my co-founder for Resilience Media is my husband, and his name is Toby Stone, and he has background in startups, investing, and within the government and policy side as well. And we had been watching the what we call the West-West response to the war in Ukraine since the invasion, and we're concerned at how what we saw was the the lack of interest in allowing existing technologies to be used in a dual-use capacity to support Ukrainians in their effort against Russia. And so we kicked around the idea of potentially doing a conference to bring together startups that are dual use security and defense focused alongside investors and people in the military, government, and policy to really actually have a conversation in person that is really challenging to achieve in the times that we find ourselves in now. So we co-founded it and had the first one in September of 2024, and it was really great. We had Nif on stage. It wasn't Kelly, but it was one of her colleagues, and yeah, we were very pleased to have Dealroom to publish this initial report at our conference, and the response to it really, to the conference, to the report, and to the ongoing media company has really helped us to know that this idea, because nobody else was doing something like this, that it was something for us to step into that void.
For sure. And Kelly, same question for you. Where was the sort of gap that you saw that you wanted to try and fill in the market?
Right. First, thank you for having me here. We're really enthusiastic to be chatting more on the defense as well as the broader space within defense. So we've been working together, Orla and Lorenzo, on kind of mapping out what the entire landscape of how we think about defense and resilience investing looks like. And it's far broader than the traditional mindset of getting technology into hands of military. It's much more so the long-term problem of how do you preserve the technological edge of the countries in the alliance, so that we're not just protected today, but more so from that is very cute, Leslie. More so for the medium and longer term. So some of those problems might fall into the energy resiliency bucket, or into different aspects within security. We're thinking about biotech, future pandemics. So how deep tech can solve the overarching problems that are very important to government as a whole. So our fund was kicked off last year. So we've been investing for just about a year now. And we have a number of direct investments as well as fund investments. So when we're thinking about the overall deep tech landscape and what could be significant to resiliency and security, it's not just the deep tech companies today, but we'll need much more of them moving forward. So we're also investing on the fund side to ensure that there's boots on the ground across all of the European landscape that we cover, to ensure those startups are also covered by folks locally.
Nice. And yeah, interested as well in your initial impressions of the data, how much is it chiming with what you see in the market? Are there things that you think that seem very different? I was thinking in particular, Kelly, one of the things that Lorenzo shared was that 80% of the European defense tech funding is being raised in UK, Germany, and France. Is that also where you're seeing 80% of the activity from the NIF side, or does that match, or are there some differences as well in what you see?
Right. Or organically, I would say that sounds about right, and it is what the data is showing. On behalf of our fund, so we cover 24 LP nations within the alliance. So our fund is structured as a kind of opt-in for different sovereigns that want to be not only investing into our fund, but also helping with adoption of the most important technologies into their governments or their large commercial. And for us, it's part of our, let's call it, mission to scope across all of the 24 nations to make sure that we're finding the best technologies, investing in the best technologies, and promoting them to the government level. So on that front, we're trying to be much broader and look at all of the edges of what is not yet known as, the biggest hubs, but rather the up and coming regions where we are seeing some really interesting technologies.
If I can chime in there, that's such a good point. I mean, we had on our stage a startup called Orca, which is a first-person vision drone, and their goal of where they were building the company was to have all of the technology produced in Europe, so that we are not reliant on technology coming out of China. And they just announced this week that they've raised nearly 6 million euros to do just that, to become the DJI of the West. And what's interesting about Orca is that they're in Osijek, Croatia. I don't know if anybody has had the pleasure to go to Osijek, Croatia, but I have been. And it's not necessarily where one would think that you'd find you'd find an amazing technical team, but you might not find a startup founder who could have this type of vision. And so it's that's, I think, where the strength in Europe really lies, is that you've got these pockets of unique space where you can actually stretch manufacturing capabilities in a way that you might not be able to, say, in London or in Reading. I think that's one of the strong points that NIF has to offer.
Right. One more thing to add to Leslie's comment, and exactly on point. When you're looking at deep tech founders, often it's called deep tech because few people in the world are capable of working on something at that level. So when we're thinking about what is most investable for us, it's the folks that can do something that almost no one else on the globe can. And that's why it's so important to be looking across the wide swath of area. So for example, when I was in Silicon Valley, I moved over from Silicon Valley to help launch this fund. There was a small seed stage company out in Portugal, and it's in those regions that you're finding companies that cannot exist anywhere else because of the unique either founder technology fit or the research fit. So it's a critical part of our mission to make sure that folks within our landscape are propped up and have the ability to grow into the large visionary types of companies.
Nice. And I think we saw the fact that VC is kind of just going up and to the right in terms of defense tech at the moment. Now, not all of that is kind of the result of defense focused funds. There's a lot more kind of broader funds that are taking more interest. I'm interested in your feeling of how perceptions around defense tech have changed in the last couple of years. Like, it almost feels like a 180 from the amount that it was being talked about or considered at all. And yeah, is that kind of what you've seen as well, or how do you feel about it? Yeah, Leslie, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, I mean, in the last few years, in the last few months, it's extraordinary. It's so I was at TechCrunch starting in 2011, and I was working in the Valley prior to that. So I'm somewhat old in terms of startup speak, and this ecosystem reminds me so much of the early aughts when San Francisco and Silicon Valley were kind of peeking their heads back up out of the dot-com crash in terms of like the amount of innovation and the acceleration that is happening. I was talking with Torsten Real after the drone announcement, and I asked him how it was being received, and he said so much better than they had anticipated, so much better than it would have been a year ago. And I said even a month ago. I mean, it's just really extraordinary how quickly the perception is shifting. And we launched Resilience Conference in February, and it was challenging in that point in time to express the vision of it and really, kind of show why we thought it was needed in the market. There are technology companies doing this work. There are people in government and military who are aligned in this way. There are investors who are aligned in this way, but there's no one kind of corralling or, convening the people. And then there's not a media company dedicated to this topic that's convening the information afterward. And it's not even been a year, and we see that there is just massive demand for something like this now.
Kelly, do you find the same thing in terms of talking to co-investors or to the media, that this is kind of almost what used to be a taboo is now encouraged or accepted?
For sure. So echoing Leslie on the fact that even in the year that we have been operating, so from the beginning to now, the number of new defense or deep tech dual use types of funds that are spinning out, I'm very pleased to see more folks in the ecosystem that we can partner with and can help the overall ecosystem grow. And I think folks are realizing that there's been two trends. One, the overall deep tech, and then from deep tech going to the more defense focused use cases. We look just 10 years ago, the world moves fast. So 10 years ago, we looked at space. The vast majority of innovation that was happening was still at the government level, at the NASA level. And then now look at the hundreds of space startups that are out there, as well as like flying satellites up there, rockets that are launching. We're moving quite quickly in terms of what used to be, like say for government types of innovation or defense, what used to be purely innovation coming out from primes are now starting from startups. And I think we're going to continue to see that at a much larger scale.
You mentioned dual use there, and a few different terms, deep tech, resilience, dual use defense. On the dual use part in particular, is that kind of, so what we're talking about is technologies that have commercial or military applications. There's a lot of people who are now saying they're open to dual use, they're like happy to invest in dual use. Has that been a useful trend? I'm just thinking like, there are some funds that actually, when it comes down to it, something might be a bit too defensy when it comes to dual use. So does it become a bit blurry and confusing, or is it helpful that more people are sort of dipping their toe at all in these kind of areas?
Probably a bit blurry, which is why when I say deep tech, and I feel the need to follow it up with the word dual use and defense. And I can say that back in say the US, I just said deep tech, and it was easy. Like, we're calling fundamental technological innovations that have big implications for a number of industries. And then upon moving to Europe, understanding that dual use is much more used for specific types of technologies. But really what I think about what is in scope for our fund and what is important for governments that are thinking about security and resilience, it's much more so on the broader deep tech side, because there's so many implications that fundamental large technological innovations can have, that they might be channeling it towards commercial today. I was talking about public company markets, like private markets, but can one day become really, really useful to government. So I don't make that differentiation off the bat. It's very much what the company can do that's important.
We also think that dual use does have a place. I know that there are some investors who are very frustrated by the leading of dual uses, like the investing lens. And I know one of them has his hand raised to potentially ask a question. But it was, as Kelly said, a great way to be able to dip a toe in. But one of the things that we think is just really critical in terms of people understanding this ecosystem, especially if you're looking at Ukraine, is one of the ways that when we've spoken to Ukrainians about their experience and how they're using tech right now, like to them in a war setting, everything is dual use. And it's mental health, it's communication, it's all the aspects of infrastructure that are being tested and taxed and having a pressure applied to them every single day in a really unimaginable setting. So there's that. And then also on the other side, we've got General Rolly Walker spoke on our stage. The Chief of General Staff of the British Army spoke on our stage in September. And his point is that you do actually need to be commercial as a startup, because the military is the world's worst customer. Like the military needs these startups to be able to survive so that they can actually make it through the procurement process to then be able to be deployed with government or military capabilities. And so it's a balancing act. But yeah, it's such an interesting perspective in terms of resilience. It's why we called the conference what we did and the media company what we did, because it is about defense and security, but making sure that everything is resilient: infrastructure, energy, climate, water. You know, it's a long runway of content for us to explore as a company, but also a very, very broad one, which makes it super exciting and really pertinent to what we're all facing these days in the West.
For sure. I've got some more questions, but it's nice that we're actually getting some submitted now. So I think we should go to the audience. So we've got one that says, how can defense tech startups balance innovation speed with the lengthy procurement cycles typical in the defense industry? Kelly, maybe one for you to start with there.
Yeah, happy to. And one of the really cool parts of this fund structure, and something we're certainly helped still building out the infrastructure after year one, is that we very much recognize that selling into government as a customer or a potential partner while they're selling to private market, it's difficult. If you're in Europe, there's a lot of countries to be facing, and each one has different policies and procedures and interactions and level of engagement. So something that we're trying to help our portfolio founders with is we're setting up an entire adoption team that has right now a few members in it, and it's going to be continue to grow. So on the helping defense tech startups or other deep tech startups that are servicing directly government to have very, let's call it, up-to-date information for all 24 countries that we cover in terms of what are priorities for them, how to best interact with them, what are the right, let's call it, ministries, departments, or the right actual people for specific types of technologies. And that way we can help expedite that cycle. And I briefly mentioned before that part of the genesis behind this fund is that we have 24 nations that have committed capital to our fund, but they've also committed and very much want us to help with adoption into their governments. So it's almost like pushing on a partially open door, and how can we help founders expedite that currently what is a longer journey.
And you've got a lot of focus areas as a fund. I know there are some founders on the call. So I'm curious, are there any areas where like you don't see the deal flow that you'd like, where there's maybe not the level of representation of startups in a space that you would like to be able to assess? And, you know, if there's anyone on the call that they should contact you about it.
That is a very good question. As we're in year one, it's felt like there's been a lot of pent-up demand. So as our team has been growing from something like 5 in the beginning to now 25, looking through all of the pent-up, that's been our tier one, the first tier of engaging with startups. And over time, as we're working with the different governments and understanding more on the capability side, as well as working on the private side, understanding in terms of deep tech what is most important and strategic to them. We're hoping to get much more nuanced in terms of a wish list for startups. And it's something that we certainly want to make more public in order for folks who are deep tech potential founders who have the ability to solve some of these really large problems to start engaging in that way.
Nice. Okay, another question submitted. Which areas of defense tech could Europe naturally excel at? Leslie, maybe you have a view there after what's been said at the conference.
So one of the things that one of the trends that we saw at the conference was disinformation, and that was really, as somebody whose journalism is very near and dear to my heart, you know, looking at how the West has been susceptible to disinformation, I think is an important topic for us to explore. I mean, disinformation has had many names. It's been propaganda, all sorts of things in our history as a civilization, but you know, the harm that it can exact on the population is really, really critical, I think, for us to explore. Also, the thing that's really is rearing, you know, coming up in conversation right now is manufacturing capabilities, and that's something that we are going to be looking at as a team. That, you know, this if what we're hearing from people is that if Trump freezes the war in Ukraine, then what we're likely to enter is a 4-year arm race with Russia. And so the emphasis moves away from rapidly innovating things towards being able to manufacture at scale later. And so it's clear that we're in the first phase of evolving defense innovation, and we've seen really amazing progress in innovating in products. Sorry, my child's also calling for me. This is founding things as a parent. But how do we manufacture more efficiently, more quickly, and manage those supply chains?
And Kelly, are there particular strengths in Europe that you see as well?
Yeah, I love the fact that you brought up supply chain resiliency, Leslie, in terms of that's an area that I've been thinking about a long time, even prior to NIF time, in terms of when you're thinking from US perspective or from the entire alliance perspective. As we're potentially entering different kinds of geopolitical risks and you're assessing those risks constantly, how can we at the highest level make sure that there are no bottlenecks in areas that are critical to us moving forward in terms of society, or defense in terms of society? So supply chain is something that touches everything that we do, anywhere from your critical minerals and materials, how to make sure that the ones that are coming from potentially adversary types of nations, potentially that could get shut off, that we have enough of that internally. And then how do we make sure on the manufacturing side, to Leslie's point, things are scalable and able to be manufactured domestically if we need to, and then domestically at a cost that makes sense. And then transportation to the end customers. So it's an entire it's an entire chain that touches everything that we do. And there's just so many areas that we can innovate. And a lot of that is still pretty old school. So that is an area that's broader than just the defense side of deep tech investing. It's something that is really important to overall government.
Mm-hmm. Right, next question with the most upvotes is, what kind of talent is necessary to grow the defense tech ecosystem? Where is the gap with talent? And I suppose maybe part of that is, as well as, is there a difference in the gap compared to overall tech? Are there particular requirements for defense tech startups where we're maybe lacking?
I'll take a stab at that, and then Kelly can chime in. But what's really interesting about defense tech is the network that's kind of inbuilt in terms of how it is able to get initially funded and then scale and grow. It's a bit more challenging from what we hear and from the people that we've been speaking with. What they've told us is that then, two guys in a garage, the startup cliche, you have to have a very specific background to be able to build the type of technology that might actually be able to. We're seeing questions about, how do you actually get into the procurement system and achieve being a program of record. But it's but then at the same time, we see, for example, founders who have been in video games before having extraordinary success within defense and security. So it's a balance, I think. But I think that the one thing that seems to bind all of them together is their mission-driven attitude and their the goal of a defense of democracy and defense of national security seems to be like the one clear driver that all of the successful founders that we've gotten to know really have in common.
So actually culture is really important then for some of these companies. Nice. And Kelly, do you see some common talent gaps in the portfolio companies you work with?
Yeah, I would say that to Leslie's point in terms of access, so it's not necessarily the background of the founder, it's access to the customer so that you know exactly what to build toward. So often if we're thinking about defense in the military aspect, often that does mean a background somewhat in that space, whether it's innovation from with the MOD or actually being in the military yourself to understand what the key pain points are. So in the end, it's not building in a silo, but really partnering and making sure integration, which has been such a key word when we're thinking about military-based technologies. Things are easy to use, integratable. So it's really the understanding of the customer. And some can call it, you can call it, that's on the product side, and then there's sales understanding of the customer. So that can, when you're thinking about the non-military side of defense and broader resiliency, it's whatever customer base, whether you're in energy or water, food security, biotech, really access to the customer to be able to build with them and then eventually sell to the broader swath of similar customers.
So people who maybe have experience working at one of the primes and then move to a startup to be able to work on that sales side?
We do see that pretty commonly in companies that are growing fast on the, let's call it, military side of defense.
Okay, cool. Next, most voted is what are your views on the tourist effect of VCs who have no prior experience from defense entering the space? Spicier question. Kelly, do you have any opinions on that one?
Yes, so we've seen this dynamic a number of times in history when you're looking at, or in recent history, when you're looking at areas that are harder to diligence and that they're newer, right? So it's not necessarily that there's so much expertise out there, but there are more startups that are coming up, and then there's more, like, it's getting into a hotter space. And then sometimes you see bubbles in terms of valuation where the folks that have been doing it for a while are pulling back because the valuations just feel too frothy for a next round. So in certain cases, it could cause distortion. It could cause more folks who haven't been at it investing than folks who have been, which the only downside from there is that it could lead to, you know, the bubble situation in which valuations come back down to earth, and then it becomes pretty painful for the overall industry. So not to say that that's happening at a massive scale here. There are certain startups that are raising at higher valuations than we would have predicted or feel like is historically warranted. But we do hope that more investors overall come into the space, as well as stick with this space in the long run to ensure that we're looking at a healthy private ecosystem as well.
And you know, the idea of tourists is definitely something that we hear a lot about as well. But this is, I think that right now there could be some short-termism as people look at the industry that actually isn't the case. You know, if we are entering a freeze with the war in Ukraine, that doesn't mean that it's over, and it means that we need to pay attention to other aspects of the industry. And so that there is a much longer tail in terms of how we can approach this particular space, which, as to Kelly's point, leaves the door open for more investors to have more time to become more familiar with the topic and become subject matter experts in it, and support the founders in the way that they really need to be supported. I know that there are founders who feel very frustrated with, you know, where they see their time being wasted, their very precious time. There's another question about, you know, how do you actually, you know, raise investment, get into a procurement process, and actually, you know, have your product be part of a program of record. Like, if you are taking meetings with VCs who actually would not add value to your, you know, to your funding round, like, then why are they wasting your time? I think is a question that needs to be looked at. But it, you know, there's got to be other ways, and this is why we think Resilience Media could hopefully, you know, take some of that pressure off of founders to have to explain the market when there's a publication of record who can actually speak to that on a regular basis.
Nice. Yeah, next question is, which trend do you see, which trends in specific defense applications and defense tech, other than AI, are you seeing that are attracting increasing investment? Any emerging things recently? Maybe Lorenzo could even return and chime in at this point as well.
Yeah, so it depends a bit if we talk really about defense, dual use, security. So definitely in the really short-term deployable tech, so let's call it like that, defense tech, a lot has been autonomy and AI in general, but there's things that are not exactly that. So there's counter drone technology, definitely has AI, but it's a lot physical. There's other stuff that are in the sense of more hardware components. So there's definitely also things like that. In the broader security space, there's been a lot of investment in also many other topics. So one is for sure critical, let's say, components and capabilities, so from space, but also AI chips, photonics, all things that we want to have some kind of supply chain that we can rely on and not be fully dependent from abroad. So these are all topics we are discussing a lot with Kelly for the upcoming reports, and there's been a lot of activity in all of these fields, and the same about advanced material and things like this. So there's definitely a lot of deal flow, a lot of activity in the market also around those spaces, and not just let's say the purely military tech.
Nice, thanks, Lorenzo. I want to get we've got a few minutes left, so I want to get a little bit more future focused towards the end as well. So the data we put together is kind of looking at what's been happening in the last few years and in 2024. But I'm kind of interested in your views of how have attitudes changed in the industry in the last 6 weeks, say, since the election on the other side of the pond, and also sort of some of your the trends that you're seeing kind of going into 2025, what you're expecting to see. So yeah, Leslie, since resilience was at the end of September, have there been some kind of notable shifts already since then?
I think Kelly's potentially better placed to speak to that, but it is interesting, the conversations that we're having. The drumbeat is really centered on manufacturing and just what does that look like? How do you innovate? From the AI layer for robotic formation underneath everything. Like how do we really position the West in that regard? And it's not the most exciting topic to talk about, but it is really where founders, investors, and the government actually see things from what we've heard.
Yeah, we were discussing this, Leslie, that we talk about deep tech, we talk about drones, but 75-80% of the one deployed in Ukraine were DJI drones from the consumer market, bought like online in different platforms from China. So that also gives a bit of the flavor of manufacturing capability.
Right, and Kelly, yeah, have you seen kind of any recent shifts in the space that you're expecting to see continue in 25?
Yeah, I can say that in the last couple weeks, it's too soon for startups to completely shift, right? So it's still from startups probably similar, but I am noticing things that are coming into my inbox, whether from introductions or out cold. There's a lot more mention of sovereignty in Europe. It's been an interesting one and quite relevant after the elections. I'd say how we're thinking about it from an investment perspective is we're still looking at the higher level types of themes. So in terms of defense, Lorenzo put up the 6 buckets, how we're thinking about the defense, security, and resiliency scape. We're looking for enduring technologies and enduring companies in those.
And what do you see
currently
as... Sorry.
Go ahead, Orla.
Sorry, you just broke off a bit from there, but yeah, I was curious about some of your what you see as some of the most promising areas, or as one person asked, who's your favorite defense tech startup at the moment? So you can choose one favorite or maybe an area if you can't pick.
Mm-hmm. We can't choose favorites among our children, but I'd say something that has been more top of mind is in the let's call it the most bottom layer of the supply chain, which is the material space. And it's something where if you can't get the materials, the rest of the supply chain doesn't work. And if we're thinking about sovereignty and we're thinking about resources, energy, there's so much that could be potentially scary. We're not thinking about it in the long run aspect. And that includes clean water, which is going to affect Europe in the next, let's call it 5-10 years. It's sooner than people might think if we don't do something about it.
All right, a little bit scary, but okay. Leslie, do you have a favorite?
Cyber resiliency is the theme that I'm very interested in, alongside mis and disinformation. So my background, even before TechCrunch, was in cybersecurity space within endpoint security, and it was deeply boring, very important, but deeply boring until Stuxnet happened, and then I was recruited to TechCrunch, and my focus shifted. But I've followed it ever since. The very first cyber warhead, and now what we see is regular attacks, and the U.S. is just, they're figuring out how to punish China for the attacks that happened over the autumn in the U.S. and seeing how fragile our cyber resiliency is. It's really, really scary. The first post that we did about resilience conference was about the flyer that Sweden sent out back in May, which was called "If War or Crisis Comes." And it's basically, how do you survive without your phone for up to 3 to 5 days before the government can step in and really help in terms of a crisis. And it's something that we stubbornly refuse to look at as a society, and something that we absolutely need to. And there's plenty of startups out there who can help protect our energy systems and all of our infrastructure that is really, really fragile and vulnerable. So yeah, very exciting and scary moments.
I was just about to say the same thing. Thankfully, there's a lot of very cool startups that are working on these problems. Yes. All right, I think we're basically out of time, so we're gonna have to wrap up there, unfortunately. We do want to just share, hopefully Lorenzo is going to share one more slide. For anybody who is interested in hearing more, we are offering 10 slots for an exclusive briefing with Lorenzo for all of your defense tech needs. So you can find the information on this QR code or on this link as well. So it's first come, first served there if you want to sign up. But thank you all so much for joining. Thank you to Leslie, to Kelly, and to Lorenzo. And we'll be back soon for the next briefing. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.